So my mom tells a hilarious story of a time out here at Beachmont Baseball where I spent all of my waking hours as a child playing baseball, but also playing on this thing that was a dirt pile. We used to keep a dirt pile in the back. That was where we would go get extra dirt for the fields. And my mom tells this story of a time when on these bleachers, my mom was probably sitting like right here watching one of my sisters play a softball game, and she heard another mom, Mrs. Stokes. Mrs. Stokes says to her son, Brian, no. And it's loud enough where you can tell the mom's getting a little agitated. And so my mom, who knew Mrs. Stokes really well, my mom kind of clues in and is like, what's going on? And then she hears Mrs. Stokes again say, no, Brian, no. And so evidently Brian's asking for something and mom is telling him no. And so my mom starts dialing in even more, leaning over. And then she hears Mrs. Stokes say, okay, Brian, fine. You can go play with Kent Evans, but when you're done, you're gonna have to take a bath when you get home. And so what Brian was asking for was, could he go back on the dirt pile and play with me, because that's where I spent all my time. And my mom cracked up and she tells this story. It is so funny. And she told Mrs. Stokes, and we all got such a great laugh out of this story. But what I find very interesting about that story is what was the problem? What was the problem with Brian playing with Ken Evans? The problem was, in the process, Brian was gonna get really, really muddy and dirty. Proverbs 13:20 says this, whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. And so I wasn't necessarily being a fool. I was probably being a fool, but like, that's not the point. The point isn't I wasn't going to spiritually lead him astray, but man, what a great physical example of who our kids hang out with does tend to rub off on them. And so I can remember, no joke, hosing myself off many nights after being at the baseball field, because that was much more efficient even than taking a bath, because I was so dirty. And kids who played with me were also going to get dirty. So Dad, are you a companion of fools? Would your wife say that the guys you kind of run with and hang out with are probably not the best influence, and some of their dirt is rubbing off on you? Would your wife say that about your own friends? Would you say that about your children? Would you say, man, my son is really hanging out with a group of people who are, not just these average teenagers who are a little immature, they're just really foolish people. Or your daughter is running in a circle of just foolish girls who are leading her down a path. Or let's get a little more real. Is your daughter or your son the fool? Are people hanging out with your kids being led astray because of your kids, just like I was going to make Brian dirty? Where do you got to look for this problem in your family? Is it in your own family, your own friend circles of the guys you're running with and the guys you're hanging out with? Is it in the circles of your children? Or is your child one of the children in those circles? Where can you dig into this challenge the most? And that'll lead us right to this week's mission. This week, let's start with our kids. Help your children embrace the idea that they want to be a positive impact on the kids around them. Somehow. And or at the same time, help your children embrace the idea that a companion of fools will suffer harm. This doesn't mean we disconnect from the world, we don't love people. It just means, how deep do we get with people who are on a path that's a destructive or evil path? Help your kids embrace these ideas this week, and you probably will have ample opportunities if you look for them around their friend circles or what goes on at school, that kind of thing. It will probably not be hard for you to find opportunities to have these conversations with your children. And then secondly, take a personal inventory. Even ask your wife, hey man, am I a companion of fools? Would you consider me to be a companion of fools, or am I walking with the wise? Am I walking with the wise? Just this week, I called a friend of mine because I was going to have a difficult conversation, and I called a friend of mine before the difficult conversation, and this friend of mine spoke wisdom into my life, and that conversation went so much better than it would have if I didn't have this wise person in my life that I could run something past. Dad, Go evaluate your own friends and ask yourself if you're a companion of fools, and help your children see how important that is in their own life. Do that this week, because you are not a father on accident. So go be a father on purpose.